institution like the UN is so important because we face, as a world, huge challenges, whether it's equality and human rights, climate change, or poverty, and only governments working together can solve those big problems because none of those problems can be solved by individual countries and citizens.
Pienso que el multilateralismo puede ayudar creando como formas de presión en países que de alguna forma nos están respetando los derechos humanos. Creo que es importante que de una forma general los países que aseguran formas de libertad, de derechos, presionen a otros que no están como haciendo.
Multilateralism includes everyone, and I think it accommodates and it ensures that the aspirations of a democracy, the aspirations of human rights, the aspirations of leaving no one behind are actually achieved and realized for everyone.
Creo que es un modelo importante que debemos preservar, sobre todo en un sistema y en un contexto en el que la diversidad de las naciones están más conectadas y necesitan más y más de un modelo que nos va a traer a todos juntos hacia una misma agenda.
I do believe that partnership on global level should give us more understanding of what we all want to achieve and make more synergies to achieve our goals.
Multilateralism has the potential to bring about sustainable world peace. It has the power to bring about fair trade, and it has the power to help us advance progress towards meeting the global goals.
For me, multilateralism is basically accepting diversity to achieve common goals.
Distinguished friends, delegates, representatives of non-government organisations, international non-government organisations, and friends of the United Nations family, welcome to this important session which has been convened by the President of the General Assembly. The President's idea to convene this session is a good one. It's entitled Building Trust and the Importance of Multilateralism, making the UN relevant to all peoples. And if you haven't got one of the President's badges, you should get one from her office. They're going at a discount price this afternoon. $2.50, is that right? It is. But beneath this slogan lies the reality of what we're seeking to do here. Those of us who have been active supporters and actively engaged in the United Nations system over many years, in some cases many decades, understand very well that the system itself is under challenge. Multilateralism as a concept of governance is under deep challenge. And therefore, the idea which the President of the General Assembly has had to convene this session is a good one. In fact, it is timely, and I would go further and say it is urgent. My further point is this, that when we look across the UN system today, we need to reflect on two core things. Number one is that these institutions which we support and which we're actively engaged, these institutions of multilateralism, they are quite new in the overall history of international relations. In fact, multilateralism is not the norm in international relations history, it's the exception. If we go back over the centuries. The second thing is this: order as opposed to chaos, global order as opposed to global chaos, is also the norm, is also the exception rather than the norm in international relations history. And therefore, the challenge to sustain the lifeblood of the institutions of multilateralism is of acute importance if we are to sustain them into the future. As you know, this institution will soon celebrate its 75th birthday. It's an important celebration. But in the back of my mind is this: where are we in 75 years' time? And can we sustain the vitality of this institution into the future? The International Peace Institute, of which I'm chair of the board, has been active on these questions for a long time. This series of reports, called UN 2030, Rebuilding Order in a Fragmenting World, was completed by IPI at the end of 2016. It seeks to look at the breadth of the UN's work, the central importance of multilateralism, and on this central question, which I believe the President of the General Assembly also poses us today, which is, how do we ensure that the UN remains fit for purpose for the future in order to sustain its legitimacy for the future? That, I think, is a challenge for us all. To conclude my opening remarks, and today I act here as moderator of this session convened by the PGA, I would simply say, let's reflect on a couple of core questions. Reflect on, are we fit for purpose? And if not, in all areas of our work, what can materially be done to make us more fit for purpose for the future? Secondly, when this great institution is attacked, as it often is, then how do we intelligently, as a community of nations and those who support this great institution, combined with united voice to defend the institution and to defend the institutions of multilateralism in the future? And thirdly, all the good stuff which the UN does every day around the world, in parts of the world which will never make it to page 1 of any newspaper in the world. How do we more effectively as an institution continue to tell the good stories of the United Nations worldwide? Because all these are essential to the question of building and sustaining trust in multilateralism, the subject which the President of the General Assembly has set for us today. So with those opening remarks, let me now invite the President of the PGA to address you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Thank you to our chair today, Excellency Kevin Rudd, as you know, former Prime Minister of Australia, President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and chair of the International Peace Institute. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of NGOs here this afternoon. I am really delighted to welcome you to this informal policy dialogue on building trust and the importance of multilateralism, making the UN relevant to all people. I stress the word informal because today's event is about broadening the conversation on multilateralism and hearing from different stakeholders. For that reason, there will be no speakers list, and we are keen to hear informal comments and not prepared statements. Before I begin, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to Kevin and the whole team at the International Peace Institute for partnering with us on yet another event, and we are really lucky to have you, and thank you very much for that. I also want to thank the Together First campaign and the UN 2020 Coalition for their generous support in ensuring we were all fed and watered ahead of this event, a very practical example of civil society supporting the UN, so thank you very, very much. Dear friends, tomorrow, member states will commemorate the first ever International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. And I warmly invite all member states to attend because it is an important opportunity for states to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter at a time when the need for multilateralism is greater than ever, but when it is facing deep challenges, as Kevin just mentioned. We are witnessing the impacts of shifting global power dynamics as the world becomes more multipolar, but also more polarized. We are seeing a rise in nationalist populism and extremist ideologies, which is putting stress on international agreements and institutions. And we are seeing a growing disconnect between people, governments, and institutions as the social contracts phrase and inequalities deepen. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, today's policy forum will consider how we can move forward in this challenging context, and I'd like to feed 4 points into our conversation today. First, despite of the threats to multilateralism, It is alive and kicking in these very corridors. It can be messy sometimes, it can be difficult, but we see it in action, day in, day out. So let us think about how we can use existing UN processes and fora to strengthen trust between stakeholders. This, of course, requires stakeholders to be in the room, which is my second point. We cannot build trust in multilateralism if we exclude the very people who are supposed to benefit from global solutions. Indeed, we cannot design global solutions with their input. I have sought to include civil society in every event I have organized, but we must do more to ensure consistent, ongoing, and meaningful engagement. Third, we need to deliver. I really hope that tomorrow's high-level meeting will go beyond warm words about multilateralism. Not because words don't matter. They matter, and they matter a great deal, as we contend with hate speech and with threats to human rights, women's rights, and civil society around the world. But words are not enough, and we know that. To build trust in multilateralism, we need to show that it can deliver, that we can deliver tangible improvements to people's lives every day. We need to keep the promise we have made through the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and so many other instruments. That also means making more effective use of multilateral bodies for financing, trade, and so on. And finally, building trust in the multilateral system means building trust in its beating heart, the United Nations. We need to show that this organization can be more effective, transparent, and accountable. I dare not say the word reform. We repeat this word over and over here in this House, because there is already a huge reform effort underway and a real danger of reform fatigue. But we are doing it. We are doing it swiftly and the best we can. I believe there are things we can do, not by reinventing the wheel, but by taking a smart strategic look at all the reviews and reports that have been produced in recent years and identifying common themes, things that were agreed but have not been fully implemented to generate a set of transformative next steps we can pursue. Dear friends, let me conclude by again inviting all member states to attend tomorrow's commemoration of the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace in the General Assembly Hall. I also want to assure everyone here that I want today's event to count. I will be producing a summary of our discussion to feed into preparation to mark the UN's 75th anniversary next year. I sincerely hope that we can use that occasion to signal that we can do things better and differently, that we can listen and learn, and that we can work together as states, civil society, business, youth, indigenous peoples to build a safer, fair, and more sustainable world. Thank you, and thank you for your attention and for coming at lunchtime.
Thank you, President, for those warm and welcoming and insightful remarks. The President's 4 points were multilateralism's alive and well. Look in these corridors. Number 2, for multilateralism to be effective, it must be fully inclusive and not exclusive of anyone who's affected by the institutions we represent. 3, the central importance of delivery, for therein lies our continuing credibility. And 4, an interesting counterpoint, the warning of the dangers of reform fatigue, but instead drawing back to where we've reached consensus positions in the past, consensus which should produce full implementation for the future. Now, we have a great panel lined up. I've been told by our Secretariat that each of these panellists is going to religiously stick to 3 minutes. So I will take this glass and hit it at the 3-minute point. And if at 4 minutes you're still going, then one of my staff will come and wrestle you to the ground. And there's a reason for that. It's called Australian rules. But it's also to make sure we have a full opportunity for everyone to participate in this important discussion which the PGA has convened. So it's my great delight to open the panel contribution to today's session by inviting Ambassador Donald Steinberg to address us, Executive Director, Mobilising Men as Partners for Women, Peace and Security. Ambassador Steinberg.
Well, thank you. Am I on?
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Minister. I'm going to speak really fast then. In my 45-year career as a diplomat, a development expert, a peacemaker, perhaps my proudest moment was helping Barack Obama prepare his pledge to work with our partners around the world to eliminate extreme poverty within 20 years, which was a building block for the SDGs 2 years later. The process of adopting the SDGs, led by Amina Mohammed and others, was indeed the most democratic, inclusive, transparent, and spirited in development history. It brought out the best ideas, it created ownership among governments, civil society, and businesses, it encouraged the spirit of compromise, and it recognized the SDGs' universal application. Based on women's empowerment, environmental protection, conflict resolution, human rights, universal health care and education, and so on, the SDGs are indeed both a powerful symbol and an entry point for UN relevance in the lives of all of its people, whether it's people who live in skyscrapers, urban slums, rural villages, or even refugee camps. Regrettably, SDG implementation has been uneven, delays significant, and backsliding common. Particularly concerning is that some countries now have sidelined the SDGs in their development strategies and their foreign aid programs. And so, as we approach the 4th anniversary, we have to return the SDGs to the heart of our global development dialogue. At the G20 summit in Osaka, the UNGA high-level political forum in July, and other settings, I believe we should take 4 actions. First, leaders must commit their countries to provide SDG national assessments, identifying in particular areas where progress has been slow and targets are in jeopardy. This process should be fully inclusive, providing all national actors with official space and ensuring that the SDGs are the common language and the reference point for national efforts. Secondly, leaders should launch aggressive public awareness campaigns within their own countries, stressing that the goals are universal, interconnected, and achievable. Optimism is a force multiplier, and people must know that we've already cut the numbers living in extreme poverty by more than half in the last 2 decades and made similar advances in health, education, food security, and other metrics that inform their lives. You picked up that glass, I was afraid you were going to hit it. Third, national leaders must fully welcome local governments into this process, since they provide key SDG services and will soon house 3/4 of the world's population. Initiatives like the Global Covenant of Mayors, the C40 Cities Network, the Climate Mayors are among the most promising steps in SDG implementation, and cities as diverse as Accra, Durban, Helsinki, Los Angeles, Madrid, Mexico, New York, Pittsburgh, Quito, and Yokohama are taking the lead. Finally, leaders must commit to fully incorporate the SDGs into national laws, budgets, and assistance programs, so that they're not subjected to reconsideration each time there's a new election or a change in national leadership. Madam President, the SDGs are an historic step forward in linking the UN-based multilateral system to the lives of all people and building trust in global cooperation. We must keep them at the center of our work to eradicate extreme poverty and give each citizen the chance to live in a just, equitable, and prosperous society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Steinberg, and thank you for sticking broadly to time. And your comment about SDGs and the engagement of local governments, one of your 4 critical points, is so important. As myself as chair of the Global Partnership of Sanitation and Water for All, SDG 6, doesn't work unless you have local government fully in harness. Our next panellist is Dr. Cecilia Nahon, Executive Director, Model G20 Initiative, American University, and former Ambassador of Argentina to the US.
Hello, everybody. How are you? It's an honor to be here today. Thank you very much to Prime Minister Rudd for the invitation and to the President of the General Assembly. It's really great to see a female leader from Latin America heading this institution this year. So I think that there are many reasons for concern. The rise of the attacks and the crisis of multilateralism is unfolding daily in front of ERIs, and it's very important that we think thoroughly and in depth of what's going on. The system is crumbling from within, and many thought that there were never going to be a crisis of this sort, a questioning of this sort of multilateralism, but it's really happening. We don't know how deep the crisis is, we don't know how long the crisis will be, but we do know some things, and I would like to focus my 3 points on the things that I think we do know that could be very, maybe good points to move forward. The first thing that I think we know is that people are right. The people are right to be anxious, that they are feeling and going through uncertainty, instability, and that all over the world people have good reasons to believe that the global economy in particular has been working to benefit of the few rather than the many. Of course that multilateralism has delivered in many elements. Clearly the reduction of poverty, in particular of extreme poverty in some countries in particular, has been a major success. But on many other elements, the promises of inclusion, prosperity, and sustainability have not really been delivered as we expected. If you take a look, for example, at the distribution of global income over the last 25 years, you can see that between 1980 and 2016, the top 1% captured 27% of total growth, while the bottom 50%, the majority, only captured 12% of global growth. So clearly, the distribution of income, the distribution of wealth, is lagging much, much behind from what the hyper-globalization mantra expected and promised. So we have not achieved the results that we expected. So my second point is, if we assume that people are right, and there are good reasons to be angry and to be frustrated and to ask for change, what are the reasons for that? And of course, we could have a whole conference on trying to understand why the system has produced these high levels of inequality, of uncertainty, of climate change and environmental disasters. But I think that we can probably sum up this in one big element. If you look at the economic, trade, and financial rules of the global economy, they have all been basically promoting to a great level of extreme the liberalization of trade, the deregulation of financing, and the financialization of the economy to an extent that was not the case until 25 years ago. There were two key elements in the global economy that clearly created these global rules that still govern the world today. In 1989, the OECD countries agreed that they will have and they will move forward a very highly deregulated financial system. In 1995, the creation of the WTO, it wasn't created to push for fair, inclusive, and balanced trade rules. But in fact, the pure goal of the WTO till now has been the elimination of barriers to trade and finance as an end in itself. So my main point here is, if we want to deliver, if we want to really seriously take into account the SDGs and work together for the SDGs, it's very important to discuss, to challenge, and to change the rules governing the global economy in terms of economic, financial, and trade elements. This means, and we hope, that instead of being just rule takers of rules that have been written mostly by the major global corporations and by the major global banks over the last 25 years, that the United Nations, that the people of the world can become rule challengers and eventually, again, rule changers. Because if we don't change the rules of the global economy, if we don't recognize and address the major challenges that have limited significantly the room of space for countries to deliver on their people, today under these rules, it's very hard to do development policy. Some concepts and some ideas that were key for advanced economies to develop themselves are not now part of the tools that a developing country can have. If you want to do subsidies, if you want to do industrial promotion, if you want to protect your intellectual property rights, if you want to develop your innovation and technological sector, there are many rulings at the global level that limit significantly the policy space. So to recover the policy space, but also to promote a people-centered multilateral system, I think that we really need to take that challenge and really promote this systemic and relevant conversation. So we can make the UN relevant to people, but also we can make all, really all, and not just the 1% relevant for the UN and multilateral cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Emphasising the central importance of the equality agenda and the economic drivers in terms of current faith or loss of faith in the multilateral system must address these economic fundamentals. Thank you again. I'd now like to welcome Professor Sakiko Fukuda-Pa, Professor of International Affairs and Program Director at the New School.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues. It really is a great honor for me to be here today. I actually have also 4 points, some of which overlap very much with what my friend Ambassador Nahon had emphasized. So my first point is extreme rising inequality. And this is a great threat to multilateralism and a symbol of what is wrong with the way that the current global economy is being governed. Cecilia has already given you all the data of the skyrocketing share of the top 1% and the stagnant, if not declining, share of the bottom 50% in terms of growth and incomes. But the reason why this is such a threat to multilateralism is because economic inequality translates into exclusion and inequality in political power and voice and influence. So my second point is that the current global economy does not have a level playing field. In a recent discussion on multilateralism at the United Nations Committee on Development Policy, of which I am a member and vice chair, colleague Professor Ha-Joon Chang reminded us that the World Boxing Championships have a more level playing field than global trade. The championships build competition on the recognition of differentiated capacity of the competitors, differentiating 12 weight groups with thresholds only 4 pounds apart. Yet the current multilateral, in fact, WTO rules are far from recognizing the gradation of countries around the world with respect to their capacities for adjustment, and for responding to new markets. And even though there is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, as has been discussed, and all of this is being further amplified in the proliferating bilateral and regional agreements. So one of our other members, Kevin Gallagher, pointed out 4 different kinds of biases that are common in current trade and investment agreements. Large economy bias, that is corporations and states, leveraging their market power to create rules in their interest. Financial and corporate interest bias, rules that favor firms and financial interests over consumers, households, and employees. Governance bias, governed by asymmetric bargaining power, increasingly shifting towards special ISDS. And I would add, shrinking policy space for states to pursue public priorities, particularly for socio-economic equity. Third, multilateralism cannot work without a foundation of shared principles. So new multilateralism needs new principles, because the realities of today are very different from those of the 20th centuries, and we need new institutions that are less state-centric, more multi-stakeholder. But they also need to build on the core principles of the 20th century set out in the UN Charter and many other documents that are still relevant. And we started very well in the 21st century by adopting the UN Millennium Declaration and Agenda 2030 that underscore principles of shared responsibility, solidarity, respect for nature, equality of individuals and states. But these need to be reflected in the practice of international cooperation and global governance. And finally, my fourth point is to emphasize the role of academic and educational institutions. These institutions are essential to generating ideas for new solutions to the common problems that we face, and in generating trust and solidarity amongst the new generation by recognizing the importance of plural voices and plural analytical frameworks. Our universities today are much too focused on pursuing one particular selected perspective. And so I think that this is another way in which academic and educational institutions can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And in particular, I was taken by your comment about reconstituting new principles, or constituting new principles to support multilateralism, an adaptation of the original principles contained in the UN Charter but made relevant to the current age. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Richard Gowan, UN Director, International Crisis Group Institute.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, President, for organising this very important event on a very important day, my mother's birthday. So in the unlikely eventuality that my mum is watching, and she probably isn't, happy birthday, Mum, and also happy birthday to Spencer, my wife's cousin, who shares her birthday. So, having made the UN relevant...
anyone else?
No, I think having made the UN relevant to two people, I would like to try and expand that to the remaining 8 billion. And I will focus on security affairs, and in so doing, I want to talk about trust, transparency, and truth in the multilateral security system. 30 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, there was a revolution in international security cooperation, and it rested above all on transparency. The former competitors of the Cold War agreed to open up to each other about their military capacities and deployments, and embedded in a series of multilateral agreements arrangements to inspect each other's military systems and divine each other's intentions. And those multilateral security agreements included the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the creation of the OSCE out of the CSCE in Europe, and beyond the European space we saw the additional protocol to the NPT and the creation of the OPCW, amongst many, many other examples of international security arrangements based on transparency and based on the idea that states could learn to trust each other if they were open with one another about their military capabilities and intentions. And that multilateral framework for transparency and trust has, to a very great degree, succeeded in keeping the world very safe over the last 3 decades. In addition, states have understood that multilateral institutions, like the UN and like the OPCW, can be reliable and impartial truth tellers in the security domain. The inspectors from the IAEA or the OPCW are trusted by a majority of states to tell us the truth about what is going on in the Iranian nuclear program or the Syrian chemical weapons war. This is an immense achievement, and as Kevin said, this is an achievement that is unprecedented in the history of international security affairs, but it is an achievement that is slipping away. We've seen many of the immediate post-1989 agreements crumble, like the CFE, and we've seen states in the Security Council dismiss and belittle the work of organizations like the OPCW, reviewing situations such as Syria. We've seen the US withdraw from the Iranian nuclear agreement, which rests on this idea of transparency and inspection. So, the transparent security system that has kept us safe is weakening, and at the same time, we're seeing a new phenomenon in security affairs. We're seeing the weaponization of artificial intelligence, cyber weapons, and other new technologies. And for those, there are no transparency mechanisms. There are no worthwhile trust-building mechanisms available. The weapons of the future are uncontrolled, unregulated, and states cannot trust each other with how they deal with these new weapons, and citizens cannot trust states to behave responsibly with those weapon systems. So if we are to sustain a multilateral security architecture that we can all trust, we need to find ways to restore transparency and build transparency around old weapon systems and new weapon systems, because otherwise we simply cannot cooperate around security at all.
Thank you so much. Isn't it interesting, as we listen to what Richard had to say, the actual term multilateral security system has even drifted out of our international vocabulary in recent years. So thank you for those sobering remarks about the dismantlement of a range of post-Cold War arrangements and the non-transparent arrangements which are now replacing them, cyber being one. Our final panelist to contribute to our discussion today is Ms. Giovanni Quelle. Have I pronounced this? Yeah. I'm sorry about that. Member of the Steering Committee, Together First, and researcher at the Igarape Institute.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to the President of the General Assembly and IPI for convening this panel and for inviting me to speak on behalf of Together First, a new global movement committed to building a global system that works for all. Together First firmly believes that even though the current climate is very difficult, we must use the UN 75th anniversary next year to strengthen the international system. That is why we are working very closely with our partners in the UN 2020 coalition to ensure that the anniversary is not just a nice tick box exercise. Today's topic is central to our work, and I will focus my remarks on the two approaches that Together First believes are crucial to building trust in multilateralism. First, as the PGA said, the best way to build trust in the UN is for it to deliver real gains for people on the ground. Many people were skeptical of the international community's ability to keep the promises it has made, having been let down so many times. But at the same time, people understand that multilateralism is our only option. It's not just nationalist populists who are popular. There are plenty of people who believe in global cooperation. 2 weeks ago, I took part in the International Civil Society Week in Belgrade, attended by hundreds of activists from across the world, and I asked them, what are the problems that only multilateralism can solve? The answer was pretty much every big challenge: climate change, of course, sustainable development, trafficking, nuclear weapons. In all Together First outreach, we find that there is a huge appetite out there for multilateral solutions. But it is also clear that people want a different kind of multilateralism. Multilateralism is about more than states. It is about people and organizations working together to achieve a common goal. And this is our second approach. People need to be much more involved in the work of the UN. This will lead to better outcomes on the ground, as well as help to build trust between stakeholders. But civil society is still often relegated to the sidelines. We are asked to do more for and with the UN, but we don't really have a voice. The Together First campaign is really about taking forward these two approaches in parallel. we are reaching out to global civil society to identify the most feasible, actionable steps to make global governance more effective and better able to deliver for people on the ground. We will refine and test those ideas, including by looking at how they sit in relation to the UN's ongoing reform processes. And we will then campaign for them, with the UN's 75th anniversary being the first stop on our campaign trail. 2 ideas already on our list. A high-level, high-profile and well-resourced UN focal point or special envoy for civil society, and the inclusion of civil society in the process leading up to the UN 75th anniversary, which was echoed by many member states in discussions on the process earlier this month. So I very much hope that everyone is in this room, representatives from governments, the UN system, civil society, will work with the UN 2020 coalition on ensuring that the UN 75th anniversary is a meaningful opportunity for stock-taking and for strengthening the UN. And I hope you will work with Together First as we seek to generate ideas that will make a difference to how the UN is perceived and how it works on the ground. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank the panelists for being so sharp and succinct in their remarks. And again, just to recap our opening reflections from the President of the General Assembly. Multilateralism is alive and well. We should celebrate that. 2, for it to be effective, it must be inclusive. 3, to be effective, it must deliver. And 4, to be effective, we should implement what we've agreed to do in the past, rather than simply reinvent the wheel. And again, reflecting on our speakers just now, Donald's core points about the SDGs, it took us a long time to get to this point of multilateral consensus. Let's not allow our national governments to slide into a different vocabulary, let alone a different set of realities. Cecilia's point about the underpinning injustices of the economic system as affecting the continued credibility of multilateral institutions in the eyes of the peoples of the world. Sakiko reinforced that point as well, together with her open question about how we redefine principles for the future multilateral order, building on those contained in the UN Charter. Richard's sobering observation about the slide back in multilateral security arrangements and the slide into new secretive national arrangements, unlearning the histories of the pre-Cold War period. And finally, Giovanna's point just now about the absolute importance of multilateralism not simply being between states, but including peoples, and therefore civil society as well. Now, friends, colleagues, delegates, we have a reasonable amount of time, about 3/4 of an hour, but I intend to leave some time for the panelists to come back and conclude at the end their own observations. I will seek to apply the same rules to everyone speaking, except a little worse. I'm going to give you 2 minutes each, because there's a lot more of you than there are of us up here, and time is limited. My final point, though, is when I call you, because I don't know who you are or where you're from, please initially self-identify, name, rank and serial number, what institution you happen to represent, and I will tap the glass if either any of you become too eloquent or too lengthy. If I could take it in this order here, the lady here and the gentleman there. Yeah.
My name is Shazia Rafi, and I run an organization called Air Quality Asia. When we look at the SDGs, they were a real success of multilateralism. Governments coming together to set very specific targets on sustainable development. I'm a little concerned that, the process of implementation, which is on this voluntary national review basis, is going to be a very slow slide to not actually getting the implementation of these targets. The ones relating to clean air, for example, 12.4, which relates to reducing chemical contamination of air, water, and soil by 2020, none of the VNRs have covered this at all. So the question is that, what is the authority of the PGA, the Secretary General, to both persuade, push, encourage governments to actually come back with reports on where they are on these targets that they agreed to. Thank you.
Excellent. And within 60 seconds, there'll be a prize at the end for the shortest presentation. You, sir.
My name is Ariel Rojas. I'm an NGO representative, and mainly my question goes to youth involvement. You smartly mentioned that multilateralism is about people. And we are seeing more and more decrease of young people in a political arena at a local level, which means that the discussion is mostly between governments and stakeholders, but young people keep missing their place in the table. So my question to you, it's how you're going to reframe multilateralism by including the new generation in the whole discussion, not only about climate change, but also quality education, gender equality, and education for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The lady at the back there, yeah.
Thank you. Madam President of the General Assembly, you mentioned trust, as did many of the other speakers today. And the Independent Commission on Multilateralism's report, also known as the Rudd Report, identifies the lack of trust as one of the impediments to multilateralism. So the reconstruction of trust is clearly of vital importance today. It's clear that while the importance of trust is generally recognized, its construction is rarely prioritized. Whether the work is too long-term or its mechanisms insufficiently understood, its results too diffuse or not flashy enough. Too few tangible resources are committed to this objective. A central focus of civil society, UN agencies, and member states alike in the coming years will therefore need to be addressing and reversing the deficits of trust at all levels of the multilateral system. An explicit commitment, universal and resolute, must be made to the global reconstruction of trust. Thank you.
Excellent observation, given the centrality of trust to the effectiveness of national and international political institutions such as this one. I'm looking for other contributors, but while we're doing so, given we have 3 observations which have been put from the floor, let me capture those for a moment. And PGA, I'm going to put you on the spot, if that's okay. The question put by our friend down here about from Air Quality Asia and about the implementation of SDGs. Her essential question is, what can you do as President of the General Assembly to cause all 193 member states to comply? Now, I'll let you wrestle with that one, and I'll turn to the others to answer the other 2 in a minute.
Well, that's really an easy question. It's very, very simple. But, you know, seriously, we are moving fast. And I think that we have 2 unique opportunities. One is the upcoming high-level political forum in July, where countries are going to come and present their VNRs, but also, and more importantly, perhaps, the first summit of the SDGs in September. And we are equipping ourselves to reach that very important moment. It's going to be you know, a summit-level event where heads of state and government are going to come together and recommit to the 2030 agenda. We are basically working on a political declaration that is going to push the agenda forward, and we are also working in the modalities of the summit, how to best use the opportunity, the momentum to recommit to the 2030 agenda. And as the Secretary General has stated regarding climate change, he said, please do not come with speeches, but with programs and plans and commitments. That's what we expect that will happen in September. And also we are waiting to see the first report on the first cut of the Sustainable Development Goals prepared by DESA, and we expect to have the report by June. We know in advance that we are not doing good enough. And there is much more that we need to do, more political commitment, but also more means of implementation, including finance.
Thank you, PGA, for that comprehensive answer in terms of the systems in place to require accountability back to the UN itself. A question was asked about multilateralism and youth inclusion. Giovanna, could I flip that to you and ask if you wouldn't mind answering?
So you asked how we can reframe including the new generation. I think this question is essential, not only because it's the new generation who will suffer the results of our inaction today, but also because they have a voice, and an important one. If we see on the news, since Greta started to go protesting in Sweden, kids are skipping school every Friday to protest for climate justice. So yes, I think they should be more included, not only here at the UN, and also including not only kids that are around, but also from the global south. I think that PGA has done a good job on that. I follow her on Twitter, so I know she listens to young people in Argentina and other countries in Latin America.
Thank you for that. And for school students striking, controversial in many countries in the world, I support the kids for what it's worth. All power to their arm. On the question of trust raised by our friend from the back there, could I turn to Sakiko to answer, please?
Thank you. Well, you know, the UN doesn't have the power of enforcement, and I think we come back to issues of civil society, actually, including the youth particularly, being actively involved as the only way in which the whole system works. And I think when PGA said that the system is working and kicking, it's because of the incredible engagement, and particularly the incredible engagement of civil society we saw in the formulation of the SDGs in the 2030 Agenda. And so, you know, I think we know how to do it in a way, but what I am most concerned about is that as the SDG process moves forward, the same engagement has lapsed. And so we don't have the same engagement of the civil society in developing shadow VNRs. I mean, you know, we need to, at the country level, at the community level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the universal level, we need to have civil society actually developing these reports, because indeed, as my own analysis shown, the VNRs are very partial in the way that they analyze implementation. And the second thing is that there is also a very important process of indicator development that is going on, and that process of indicator development also lacks civil society engagement, because many of the indicators that are selected actually dumb down the ambition, the transformative ambition of the SDG agenda. And we need much more engagement and to hold the whole process accountable to the commitments of the agenda. Thank you.
Before I go back to the floor, I would like to ask Donald to add quickly on the SDGs point.
Not a single local government or state.
Push your mic, mate.
Thank you. I wanted to just raise two paradoxes. One is that not a single province, state, or locality signed on to the SDGs, and yet we have a flood of voluntary local reviews coming in and leadership in that space, in contrast to voluntary national reviews. And I think the answer here is that in part governments at the federal level are not as committed to local citizens' health, education, housing, etc., as their own officials of cities and municipalities and all. And so we are in a prime position for naming and shaming in this situation. And I believe that we all have that capability. The second paradox is that in almost every development program that we see right now, we have developed time-bound measurable goals with feedback loops and accountability provisions in order to monitor and evaluate what we have achieved. And yet, those same governments that apply those principles to everything that they do in this space are unwilling to meet those requirements when it applies to them and the multilateral system. If anyone can answer those two paradoxes for me, I think you get the new Nobel Prize.
I was offering a prize before for the shortest contribution, but that's upped the stakes considerably. So anyone who answers the double paradox gets a prize later on. I have a request over here, sir. I think you had your hand up, and then to the lady up there. Is that okay? To you, and then I'll come to these two ladies up the front. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. William Pace with the World Federalist Movement and part of the 2020 campaign. I wanted to make a brief observation. In these last 25 years, I think almost all of the major, not all, but almost all of the major progressive achievements in multilateralism have been not the product of the big powers taking leadership, but have been the product of the small and middle power governments working together across regions and across sectors in informal and sometimes formal, sometimes informal coalitions, sometimes government groupings, etc. And those groupings of the small and middle power nations very often were linked up, again, formally sometimes and informally most often, with global civil society networks and coalitions, including local authorities. So from the World Conference process, the Landmines Treaty, the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, the peace architecture, responsibility to protect, the human rights architecture reform, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, etc. All were not primarily led by big powers at all, but were small and middle power achievements with civil society. And I think in terms of achieving the kind of future for the United Nations from the 75th, this has to be baked into how we're moving forward. And we do have institutions here that are still primarily dominated by a few big power countries that are paralyzing the entire peace and security works. And the last point I wanted to make is the very great regret that we're seeing is not only is work of civil society who are trying to support multilateralism being downsized and underfunded, but the governments themselves have systematically been downsizing their capacities in foreign ministries and legal ministries, etc., to do multilateral work. And I think hopefully in this next 1 or 2 years that could be addressed, that the small and middle power countries need to gear up so that they can take greater advantage. And where it will be done at the UN is not in the Security Council, it'll be done in the General Assembly. Thank you.
Excellent contribution, sir. You go to the whole literature of the role of constructive powers in the multilateral system and how small groups of countries who are committed to producing global public goods can achieve many things through this institution as they've done in the past. That, I think, is a topic for rich further reflection. The lady at the back there, third from the end, thank you. And then these two ladies here, and then you, sir. Is that okay?
Is this on? I'm Sarah Burke with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in New York, and I would like to echo what both Cecilia Nahon and Sakiko Fakudapar have said, that we need to change the rules of the global economy and become the rule makers rather than just the rule takers. But as we all know, that the interests of those that have power over the rules at present tend to co-opt multi-stakeholder fora while seeking to avoid genuine social dialogue. So we know that the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD all engage in this kind of obfuscation of real social dialogue, where the interests of workers, employers, and governments are there on an equal footing. So I would like to ask the panel their views of the possible role of collectively organized workers to enforce something like regulation from below. What I mean by that is whether workers, for example, in financial firms and banks, can blow the whistle when they engage in illegal and illicit practices like workers at Wells Fargo or Santander or Deutsche Bank have done, or when workers in manufacturing firms like Boeing can blow the whistle on the cover-up of unsafe practices. What is the possible role of this kind of actor with the multilateral effort at reform that we're discussing today? Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I could go to lady in the front, then you, and then you, sir. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sofia Simone, and I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of Armenia. And thank you for the fascinating conversation we're all enjoying. Now, we heard from the panel about the slidebacks and challenges facing multilateral systems, multilateral security arrangements, global economy arrangements. Now, from the perspective of another very important pillar of the UN work, human rights, what would be the challenges facing multilateral institutions and also in terms of rebuilding trust? Mr. Gowen spoke earlier about the validity of the assessment produced by international multilateral experts who are trusted about what they say. So I guess my question is to be seen in this particular context, also in the context of protection and promotion of human rights and freedoms. Thank you.
That's going to be a fun one to answer. We look forward to it. Then here and then back there.
Hi. Pilar Perez from the delegation of the Catalonia in the US. Just to confirm that citizens has to be part of the important decisions because they want to be, and because they are pushing to the power centers in order to find the ways. That's the obligation of the power centers, to find ways, because the citizens are pushing very hard. And in a world of confusion, with increasing mistrust in information channels, multilateralism need to find secured ways, easy ways, to listen and implement what the citizen really want for themselves. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Philip Odida. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of Uganda. Being a diplomat, I have to at least start off by thanking Madam President for organizing this, and through her, you, Mr. Moderator, and also the excellent panelists. About 30 years ago, I served at our embassy in Washington, D.C. as a junior officer handling economic affairs. Uganda is a landlocked developing country. We took the bitter pill of structural adjustment and we transformed our economies. I think today, like many other developing countries, we're seeing, as has been characterized, rising youth unemployment and other problems that are kind of characterized, I think, on the panel. My question really goes to the presentation that was made by Dr. and Ambassador Nahon, and how she characterized it from the point of view of the overriding liberal policies that we have globally. And my question is there any space where any discussion of this problem, seeking any alternatives, is being discussed and propagated, either even within the halls of the UN or anywhere else? That's just a question, because we live in a world in which the whole environment of how we understand our life is premised on the ideals of liberalism. So I thank you.
I'm going to flip back to the panel for some responses. Sir.
I'm a graduate student of international affairs. My question is whether multilateralism is a value in and of itself, as we heard from the Security Council last week, and what happens when it clashes with other values, as we often see in the UN bodies.
It sounds like Philosophy 101, but it's going to be an interesting question. I'll take one other here, and then we'll come back to the panel. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you so much as first for the very encouraging, especially involving, engaging the civil society. I am Birjan and I represent the Late Millennium Organization. We are associated with the Department of Global Communications. What I haven't heard of is secularism has not been mentioned. When we are talking about multilateralism, then when we talk about as a nation base, so during the last 20, 30 years, we see that there is tremendous removal, secularism and also separation of powers. And also women, gender parity, Ambassador Chowdhury referred PGA on March 21st that it went from the 30 years ago, 30 years differences to 107 years. So when we don't talk about why the freedom of expression is not giving enough importance at the UN as freedom of religion pushed in too much, and then freedom of expression kind of pushed out, and secularism in the war pushed out, and when the fundamentalism pushed in. So when we're not including all these key factors into multilateralism, then gender parity will maybe go 150 years. That's a comment. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. I think I see the Ambassador of Egypt's light on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate giving me the floor, and I would like to thank the PGA for her leadership and the IPI and distinguished panelists for their valuable presentations and the previous speakers. Briefly, one thing, of course, I think we are facing a very much existential paradox between the what we all talk about in this session and in other formats about the pressure of multilateralism and the threat to multilateralism, but at the same time that we have no other way forward because the challenges are becoming so much immense and intense in a manner which no one power or party, big or small, can fix it alone, and at the same time no one party, small or big, can be immune of its consequences. So we have a shared destiny of humanity, and this, of course, is exacerbating the feel of this paradox and this crisis. Other thing that one of the thing of also of the problems that though we are having multilateralism in shape, when it comes to content, it's maybe much lacking, because multilateralism is not only we are having multi-participants, but we have multi-influential and decision-making process, and this, I think, is much lacking. So there is also discrepancy between the shape of multilateralism and the content of multilateralism. The last point, and I think this leads to what we sometimes we can call pseudo-multilateralism. There is a shape without real content. Last point about the reform processes which are ongoing in the UN. What, in the view of distinguished panelists, would be the most important one or the practical way forward in order to enhance in these processes of reform, in order to really help making the multilateral system being more enhanced and more effective. And in historical perspective, is this something new which we are facing now, or this is something which has been going ups and downs in previous eras, and what lessons we can draw from previous historical experiences in this field? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those 3 points. I keep saying that's the last contribution. I think our friend from the European Union is lurking in the gallery. Sir.
Thanks for spotting me, Mr. Rudd, and all protocol observed, obviously. I'll be very brief. I'm simply very interested in picking the brain of the distinguished panelists on improving our communication. I don't think we're reaching the people that we have to reach. I think there is a gap between, all our good intentions when it comes to communications and public diplomacy and the effect or the lack of effect that has. I mean, the EU itself has also been struggling with it, is still struggling with it, and I also see that the same feature in the United Nations. And obviously is a dynamics between the UN and the member states that have a responsibility as well. But what could we do, what could we improve when it comes to our communication efforts? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful of the clock. We have a little more than 10 minutes to go. So with these questions, I'd like to come back to our panelists, and I will brutally assign questions to individual panelists and then conclude with you, PGA, if that's okay. The questions that I've picked up, first of all, from our friend and colleague from Uganda, I think that was a question specifically directed to you, Cecilia, if that's okay. Then on the question of human rights and freedom of expression, I'm merging two sets of observations there. On the human rights front, do I have any willing takers? Thank you so much, Sakiko. On the point raised by our colleague over here about the actions of small and middle powers, perhaps, Richard, if I could turn to you on that one, because I'd like to hear your views on that, particularly from the security perspective. And then we had, I thought, the interesting question from the gentleman halfway up the back about is multilateralism a value in itself, or is it one of many? And I'm going to flip that to Don Steinberg. And then on the question of communication, PGA, I might come back to you on the question of how do we communicate more effectively the UN's message. Please excuse me if I've skipped over any of those questions in their essence, but I've tried to...
Human rights.
Yes, human rights is being addressed here.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm about to say to the panelists, if you have comments in addition to the answers to the question I've indicated, please add as you see fit. And of course the PGA, you can do what you like, because it's your show and not mine. And so perhaps we could start at the end there, if that's okay with you, Richard.
Thank you. I'll primarily respond to the question about middle, small and big powers. I will say one thing on human rights and communications. Bill, I don't completely agree that big powers have been irrelevant to the story of multilateralism since the Cold War. I think without the George Bush senior administration, we wouldn't have anything like the multilateral system we have today. I think without the Obama administration and its cooperation with China, we wouldn't have the Paris climate change agreement, and of course without Paris and France, we wouldn't have that either. Without the P5+1, we wouldn't have had the Iranian nuclear deal for what it was worth. I think that big powers can still invest in multilateralism and can still drive multilateral reform when they want to, but I think you are right that at the present time, and often in the past, it is only possible to get big powers to act through the UN or other multilateral frameworks if there is a very, very strong push from a wide range of other middle powers, both in terms of ideas and political pressure. Right now, I see a lot of countries in this building being nervous to go up against the US or to go up against China or Russia on questions of multilateral policy. I think if you want this organization to succeed in the next decade, it's going to be necessary for countries to band together, especially working through groups like the European Union and African Union, to make their feelings felt on major issues of multilateral policy, to get hearings from the big three. On human rights and on communications, I would say one thing. The UN is important to human rights, but it is not necessarily the driver of human rights. What changes feelings about values and human rights is not stuff coming out of Geneva. It is stuff coming off the street, and it is stuff coming from dissidents in countries where the human rights are being repressed. And so we must continue to work through the Third Committee of the General Assembly, we must continue to work through the Human Rights Council, but human rights advocates have to really reach out to the public and communicate to a global public and not get caught up all the time on UN affairs. And this links to communications too. Too many NGOs think that success is getting one line of their talking points into a General Assembly resolution, which no one will read. Sorry, PGA. Real success in communications is making people outside understand the good that the UN is doing and why it is urgently needed. And I think, PGA, you have understood that. What we convince people in Turtle Bay is irrelevant if we can't convince people outside Turtle Bay that this place matters, and a lot of communication weight has to be put on that.
Thank you so much. If I could now turn to Cecilia.
Well, thank you for the question. In fact, there are many organizations, both within the UN system and outside the UN, that are working on rethinking the international order and the multilateral rules. There has been a very interesting report just published last week, done by UNCTAD and the Boston University, that talks specifically about that, how a new multilateralism is being built for shared prosperity. They have principles. It's really an interesting discussion. I think also that one of the issues that are tackled there relates very well with what the colleague mentioned in terms of this role of small and middle powers. And I do agree that this is a specifically critical moment for small and middle powers getting together, coordinating their agendas. Strength is in the numbers in this moment, and there's a lot of change to make. And I remember very well, I was very involved personally in 2015 with 136 countries of this institution decided to approve in the General Assembly a resolution with 9 guiding principles for sovereign debt restructuring. And when we began that process, it seemed absolutely impossible because all the major countries opposed. In fact, they voted against it. It was only 6 votes against, but 136 in favor. And that was a resolution that not only was critical for developing countries, because it's related with debt, which is a key issue, but it also showed that there's a way to change the rules, I think the economic, global, and financial rules from the United Nations. Of course, there's a lot more to do, but that was a key element. And this also relates with trust. I think that if we want the institution to reshape and rebuild trust, it has to deliver, as we said, but this also needs to go much further than the cosmetic, than the rhetoric, than the communications, which of course are also important. But I think it's the substance, it's the content of those rules, of this international order, of this rules-based international order that I insist have to be discussed and reviewed. And not only I want to highlight the issue of debt, as I did, but I just want to highlight as well very much the issue of taxes and tax regulation. And again, sometimes these issues seem far from the people here, but in the current world, the young are looking at the scandals, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, all the time in the media, the big corporations, the billionaires don't pay their taxes, and the people do. And what is the UN, what is the system doing about that? Just one last statistic to share with you. 40% of the profits of multilateral corporations, according to a very serious American thinker, do not go to tax havens. They don't come to their countries where they are originated. So just to finalize, I think that, again, civil society has to be heard. I agree with that, and there's a very good occasion to do that. Maybe you know, but 300 institutions, civil society, labor organizations, grassroots movements from all around the world just issued a few weeks ago a very strong declaration calling for the WTO so-called e-commerce negotiations to stop and give more time for developing countries. And I'm highlighting this now because that's a negotiation that is ongoing, that we can, in fact, change and make for the better. And if they foresee in how it is being carried out, it's going to be really the end of the possibility of developing countries, small countries, and people to implement sovereign policies on digital economy, which is basically the economy.
Thank you so much. Sakiko.
Human rights, what are the big challenges? Well, of course, there are many, but I want to highlight economic and social rights and the need for human rights to get out of the silo. Economic and social rights are basic principles that protect human beings, right? And they protect human beings so they can live a life of dignity and freedom. And it sort of protects you against grave threats. And many of these grave threats are coming in economic and social areas, cultural areas. It's not just about political prisoners. And the way that economic rules are formulated actually don't pay much attention to economic and social rights consequences. You know, we talk in the human rights field about having to do human rights impact assessment of trade and investment agreements. But this has been a theory that has never been properly practiced, although the European Union actually has included that in one of their procedures, but the implementation has been not as aggressive as one might have wished. So I think that breaking down these silos between human rights and other areas of activity in the United Nations and elsewhere is a real priority for more inclusive multilateralism.
Thank you so much. Donald.
So just to pick up very briefly on that point, as I said before, the key to the SDGs and the universal applicability for me was they did recognize that it was more than just health and education and housing. It was women's empowerment, environmental protection, conflict resolution, human rights. There was an understanding that this was an interconnected matrix of activities that went beyond the simple sectoral approach. To address the question directly about multilateralism and is it a goal in and of itself, I think it's important to make a distinction between what we're talking about multilateral as opposed to unilateral. If we're defining multilateralism as Wikipedia defines it, which is an alliance of multiple countries pursuing a common goal, for me, I think what everyone here has said is it's not just about nation states. In my day job, I actually help American NGOs become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive in their international behavior. And I think that's the principle that we have to apply to this system. We have to be diverse. That is, everyone at the table, whether it's business, whether it's LGBT community, whether it's women, whether it's indigenous populations, etc., not just governments. Secondly, it has to be inclusive, i.e., you're not just at the table, you are empowered. You have an opportunity to influence the result of the discussion that's taking place as a participant, as a beneficiary, but also as a leader. And finally, equitable, so that the outcome matters, that it is based in economic, political, social empowerment, so that we are looking at issues related to the power dynamics in relationships between countries, between businesses and workers, between men and women, between straight people and the LGBT community, that it is absolutely essential to apply that power dynamic consideration and ensure that things are, quote, equitable. So again, it isn't so much multilateralism for itself, but for the diversity, equity, and inclusiveness that it can bring.
And if I could finally turn to the President of the General Assembly.
Yeah, please.
Sure. I'm sorry for skipping over you. I'd flipped to Giovanna just before, but she gets a second chance. Giovanna,
okay, thank you.
and then
no,
to
I really
you,
want to
PGA.
talk about communication, because that's what Together First and the UN 2020 Coalition are about. They are about strategic communication, about talking to the UN, to the member states, and also giving voice for other organizations. I was in Belgrade 2 weeks ago, and one of the things I hear the most from the organizations that were there is that they feel the UN is something really distant from their daily lives. And they are the grassroots organizations. They were working on a daily basis with their communities. So I do think that we need someone at the Secretariat to boost and support the NGOs, but also to serve as a voice for pushing against the shrinking of civil society space. Thank you.
PGA.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I think that we're running out of time. Just to thank everybody to really have a true and honest and interesting creative conversation. I think that was the whole purpose, to prepare for tomorrow high-level event on the first ever International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. So thank you very much. I would just make two very brief comments. One is on communication again. I think we're very, very much aware that one of the elements of making the UN relevant to all is translate our work permanently. And I try to do that every day. I insist of the need to replace acronyms by synonyms. We live in a world of acronyms. Sometimes, even being the president of the General Assembly, sometimes I have to say, but what is ICPTD, whatever, and what is, and that's the way basically we communicate with the outside world. I don't know if you checked the video that we shared at the beginning. And we have done focus groups about people, what they think about the UN. When you show them the flag of the UN, they smile and they like the UN. But when you ask people outside in the street, what is the UN, what is the work of the UN, they start to really, not knowing what to say. If you push and push, sometimes they say, oh, UNICEF, they work with children, they do nice things, but they cannot explain what we are all about. And I think we need to win the communication battle, translating our work, connecting to the people we serve. And you say you follow me on Twitter. Yes, not only when I travel to the developing world, but wherever I am, wherever I go, I engage with young people. I go to universities at least once a week. I deliver speeches. I talk to the people out there, and I think that we should all be spokespersons for the UN in a way. So I think we need to do more and better on communication. I hold Every month I hold a morning minga, which is a morning dialogue with permanent representatives here. The last one was precisely on our communication deficit. And there were very good ideas that came up of that. The second issue I wanted to mention is perhaps to follow up on what the ambassador of Egypt said about the existential paradox of multilateralism. And I think that I think we all agree that there is a lot of pressure on multilateralism and the capacity of the multilateral system to deliver. And I think that it's both a challenge but also a great opportunity, because it has given us the space, the possibility to unite more, to recommit, to refine our own narrative, and also to find common denominators. And I started by saying that we should avoid acronyms, but I came up with an acronym myself that I share with my team every day, which is the DARE acronym. I think we should dare do things differently. And DARE stands for delivery, accountability, relevance, and efficiency. And we are working on that. Sometimes, we will never make front pages on the reform process that is very profound, very structural, reform process of the United Nations. We are not going to make front pages on the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly. So there is an intergovernmental process which has a lot of traction, and we hope that we will have, you know, a real strong and ambitious outcome of that process. And just to close, when they say, well, no one reads the resolutions that are passed by the General Assembly, and I have to tell you, basically, you know, three things. First of all, I think, yes, in this session up to now, we have come up almost with 300 resolutions, only during this session. 300 resolutions, and I think that gives us, you know, a full menu of the issues that are important to the multilateral system. Because we have to remind ourselves that we are the norm-setting body of multilateralism, we are the policy-making body, and we also are aware that we are facing what I call an implementation deficit. And I think that this goes hand in hand with a recommitment to the multilateral system, to really come up, you know, with a strong political will to make sure that we deliver and that we are serious when we pass a resolution, that it means something. And regardless if the public reads the resolutions or not, I think that the themes embedded in the resolutions are extremely relevant and do make a difference. And I can cite many examples, but we don't have time. I think I took more than 5 minutes, but thank you very much for being here once again, to the IPI and the partners that have made this possible. Thank you, Kevin, for great chairmanship, but you have the last word.
I picked up 7 common themes, and I'll give them a sentence each. The fundamental question of the fairness of the global economy as impacting on the future effectiveness of multilateralism. Secondly, the Sustainable Development Goals. Entrench their language, implement them, even consider shadow VPRs by civil society. And I remember when the SDGs were passed, and I think it's reflected in the report we did in 2016. This is a great opportunity for the United Nations family, but it's also a double-edged sword. If we fail with Agenda 30, so too does the credibility of multilateralism fail. It is both our opportunity and, if you like, our potential for the reverse. Number 3, inclusive multilateralism, gender, youth, civil society. Number 4, multilateralism relying for its future energy not just on the great powers, but medium and small powers as well, to bring about creative, constructive diplomatic initiatives across the remit of what the United Nations is intended to do. 5, the continuing thematic of the President of the General Assembly. I can't say PGA now because we're in an acronym-free world. It's just shorter, President. The critical question of delivery, and it's been a constant theme in your remarks today. And it is a statement of the obvious, but it's a statement of the supremely important, that words without effect, practical effect, ultimately undermine credibility further. My earlier point on the SDGs. Point number 6, communications. The excellent contribution again made by the President. In response to it, and my own response to it would be a bigger communications budget which national delegations agree to, not as a waste but communicating to the world's taxpayers who fund this institution. 7, the Ambassador of Egypt's telling question at the end, which I neglected to confront every speaker with, which is, what's the single reform that you would embrace if you had the opportunity? I'm very much taken by the Secretary-General's approach to prevention. If that becomes an entrenched doctrine across all that we seek to do in security and in humanitarian matters and in development and in climate, then frankly the world would be measurably a better place. Beyond that, though, Ambassador, I would say this. Whenever this thing is attacked, the United Nations, let's not be silent. We need to defend the institution. When a particular state takes it upon itself to attack the United Nations, I believe we have a general responsibility to defend the institution as well, and to tell the good stories of what the UN has done. And finally, on behalf of you all, I'd also extend to Richard's mum a very happy birthday. Where is she today, Richard?
Having a very nice meal.
Okay. Well, many happy returns to her today. I won't ask you all to sing happy birthday because she is not with us, but please pass our birthday greetings to your mum. Could I ask you all to put your hands together to thank the President for this initiative and the panel for being such first-class contributors.